Hidden in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, there lived a family whose appearance stopped strangers cold. Their skin was blue. Not from cold, not from illness in any ordinary sense, and not from anything that could be explained with a quick glance or a simple question. The Fugates of Troublesome Creek were real people, living real lives, raising children, and growing old in the hollows of Appalachia. And generation after generation, some of them came into the world with skin the color of a bruise and lips as dark as a storm cloud. For most of the outside world, they remained invisible. The hills kept their secrets well. No railroad reached them easily. No doctor came looking until more than a century had passed. And so the blue people of Kentucky lived quietly, enduring whispers and stares, while the rest of the country went on knowing nothing about them. But science, when it finally arrived, told a story far more fascinating than anyone expected. Hidden in the Fugate bloodline was a rare genetic condition, amplified by isolation and intermarriage, that turned ordinary blood into something darker and stranger than textbooks had prepared anyone for. This is the story of the Blue Fugates of Appalachia, and how DNA finally solved their real secret. The story begins in 1820, when a young man named Martin Fugate made his way to one of the most remote corners of Kentucky. He settled along Troublesome Creek, a winding stretch of water deep in the Appalachian hills, far from the nearest town, and farther still from anything resembling a main road. Martin was said to have come from France as an orphan, crossing the Atlantic with little behind him and nothing guaranteed ahead. What he found at Troublesome Creek was land, isolation, and a woman named Elizabeth Smith, who would become his wife. By most accounts, Martin Fugate himself had blue skin. This detail has never been fully confirmed by written records, but family stories repeated it consistently enough that researchers later took it seriously. Whether or not Martin truly carried the blue appearance, what happened next was not in doubt. When he and Elizabeth began having children, the color showed up. Their son, Zachariah, was born with blue skin. 3 more of their 7 children followed with the same unusual appearance. At the time, no one in the hollow had a name for what they were seeing. There were no clinics nearby, no specialists to consult, and no framework that could explain why some children emerged from the womb with skin that seemed to belong to another world entirely. The neighbors knew. Word traveled between the tight-knit families of the hills. But the outside world heard nothing, and Troublesome Creek stayed quiet about its blue people for a very long time. What Martin and Elizabeth could not have known was that they each carried a hidden instruction buried deep in their biology. A recessive gene, invisible in both of them, had combined in some of their children to produce something neither parent showed on the outside. The blue was not a curse, not a punishment, and not a mystery from the spirit world. It was genetics, waiting a century to be understood. To understand why the Fugates turned blue, you have to understand something about blood. In a healthy person, red blood cells carry oxygen through the body using a protein called hemoglobin. That hemoglobin stays in a form that can pick up oxygen, deliver it where it is needed, and return for more. The system works quietly and automatically, kept in balance by enzymes that patrol the blood and correct any drift before it becomes a problem. In the Fugates, that system had a flaw. They carried a rare recessive gene that caused a condition called methemoglobinemia. In people with this condition, a portion of the hemoglobin converts into a form called methemoglobinemia, which cannot carry oxygen the way normal hemoglobin does. As methemoglobinemia levels rise in the blood itself grows darker. In an ordinary person, methemoglobinemia accounts for less than 1% of total hemoglobin. In the affected Fugates, that figure climbed to between 10 and 20%. The difference was visible to the naked eye. Dark blood, flowing beneath fair skin, produced a blue cast that was impossible to miss. The lips turned purple, the fingertips darkened. Arterial blood, which should have run a bright red, came out looking chocolate brown. It was not a trick of light or a temporary reaction. It was the permanent color of blood that was carrying less oxygen than it should. What made the Fugate case so rare was the genetic path that produced it. Methemoglobinemia of this inherited type requires a person to receive the defective gene from both parents simultaneously. Carrying one copy changes nothing visible. Only when both copies arrive together does the condition appear. Martin and Elizabeth Smith each carried one copy without showing any sign of it. In the children who inherited both, the blue emerged. The gene had been there all along, waiting silently for the right combination to bring it into the light. The gene alone was not enough to turn Troublesome Creek into a community of blue people. What made the Fugate situation extraordinary was the world that surrounded them. Eastern Kentucky, in the 19th century, was not simply rural. It was sealed off in ways that are difficult to imagine today. There were no railroads cutting through the hills. The roads that existed were little more than muddy tracks that became impassable in bad weather. Rivers and creek beds served as the main routes of travel, and even those were unreliable. The result was a community folded in on itself, generation after generation, with almost no outside movement in or out. When the time came for young men and women to marry, their choices were narrow. The families of Troublesome Creek knew each other intimately. The Fugates, the Stacys, the Richies, the Smiths, and the Combses all lived within walking distance of one another. Marrying a cousin was not considered scandalous in that world. It was practical. It was familiar. It was, for many, the only real option available. The consequences for the Fugate gene were severe. Each marriage within the family created a new opportunity for two copies of the recessive gene to meet in the same child. Zachariah Fugate, one of the first known blue members of the family, married his own aunt. One of their sons later married a close cousin. That pattern repeated itself across branches of the family tree, tightening the genetic knot with each generation until the condition was no longer a rare surprise, but an expected presence in certain family lines. One family member, Alva Stacy, later captured the situation with a single dry remark to a researcher. He said simply that he was kin to himself. It was a joke, but it described the reality of Troublesome Creek with more precision than any academic study could have managed. Of all the blue Fugates who ever lived along Troublesome Creek, one name stood apart from the rest. Luna Fugate was remembered by those who knew her as the deepest blue the family had ever produced. Not slightly blue, not faintly tinged, but blue in a way that left people speechless the first time they saw her. A local nurse who encountered Luna years later could not find stronger words to describe what she witnessed. The bluest Fugate she ever saw, the nurse said, was Luna, blue all over. Her lips as dark as a bruise, as blue a woman as she had ever seen. Luna came into the world, carrying both copies of the recessive gene in full force. Whatever combination of ancestry had produced her, it had done so with unusual completeness. And yet Luna did not live as an invalid or a curiosity. She lived as a woman. She married a man named John Stacy, who had first spotted her at a church service one Sunday and apparently found something worth pursuing beyond the color of her skin. The two courted, married, and went on to have 13 children together. John Stacy, for his part, refused to discuss whether his wife was blue when researchers later came asking. Whether that silence came from protectiveness, pride, or simply the conviction that it was nobody's business, he never explained. What the record shows is that he chose her, stayed with her, and built a life beside her that lasted decades. Luna lived to the age of 84, raising her children and growing old in the same hills where the Fugates had always lived. Her story matters because it puts a human face on what could otherwise become an abstract medical case. Luna was not a specimen or a symbol. She was a woman who happened to be blue in a world that had not yet decided what to make of that. One of the most surprising facts about methemoglobinemia, at least in the form the Fugates carried it, was what it did not do. It did not shorten their lives in any dramatic way. It did not leave them bedridden or in constant pain. Luna Fugate lived to 84. Others in the family reached similarly advanced ages, raising large families and working the land the way their neighbors did. For a condition that turned blood dark and skin blue, the physical toll was remarkably quiet. The oxygen levels in their blood were lower than normal, but not low enough to cause the organ damage or cognitive decline that severe methemoglobinemia can produce in more extreme cases. What the condition did cause was something harder to measure and harder to treat. The psychological weight of looking different in a small, tight community was real and lasting. The Fugates and their blue relatives knew from childhood that their appearance set them apart. Strangers stared, neighbors whispered. And as time passed, and outside knowledge about inbreeding began to spread into even the most isolated corners of Appalachia, the blue skin became associated not just with difference, but with shame. It was visible proof of the intermarriage that had produced it, written on the body for anyone to read. The family responded by withdrawing. They had always lived at a remove from the outside world, but as the stigma grew, that distance became deliberate. They kept to themselves, avoided unnecessary contact with strangers, and learned to live with the stares when contact could not be avoided. By the time medical researchers finally came looking in the 1960s, the blue members of the family were described as deeply uncomfortable in public settings. They would not sit in waiting rooms. They made clear, without saying much, how much the whole thing had cost them. The blue skin had never been a danger, but the world's reaction to it had been its own kind of wound. In the early 1960s, word of the blue people of Kentucky reached a hematologist named Dr. Madison Cawein, who was working at a medical clinic at the University of Kentucky. The story intrigued him enough that he did something unusual for a specialist of his standing. He left the clinic and went into the hills to find them himself. Armed with little more than curiosity and a medical bag, Cawein began making his way through the hollows of eastern Kentucky, asking questions and following leads wherever they pointed. He did not have to search entirely alone. Along the way, he connected with a nurse named Ruth Pendergrass, who had her own encounter with the blue people to share. Some time before, a woman had walked into the county health department where Pendergrass worked. The woman's skin was unmistakably blue. Pendergrass, convinced she was watching someone in the final moments of a heart attack, was genuinely frightened. She said later that she was certain the woman was going to die right there in the waiting room. The blue woman herself was not alarmed in the slightest. She explained calmly that she was from the Blue Comses who lived up on Ball Creek, and that her family had always looked this way. Pendergrass joined Cawein in his search, and together they eventually located members of the Fugate family, along with blue individuals from the Combs and Ritchie families. Cawein interviewed them carefully and drew blood samples. Studying what he found, he concluded that the affected family members were missing a specific enzyme, one responsible for converting methemoglobin back into functional hemoglobin. Without it, the dark form of hemoglobin accumulated and the blue remained. Before I show you what happened next, if you want to trace conditions like methemoglobinemia inside your own raw DNA results, I built a 3-volume PDF guide bundle over at the OriginDNA website. It shows you how to read your raw data and find matches beyond what Ancestry or 23andMe tell you. Link is in the description. But stay right here, because what comes next is the part most people completely miss. Once Dr. Cawein understood what was missing from the Fugate blood, he moved quickly toward a solution. The enzyme their bodies failed to produce was supposed to keep methemoglobin levels in check, cycling dark hemoglobin back into a form that could carry oxygen properly. Without it, the dark form accumulated and stayed. What Cawein needed was something that could step in and do the job the missing enzyme was not doing. What he reached for was methylene blue, a synthetic dye with a long history in medical treatment and a color that made the decision seem almost absurd on the surface. Injecting blue dye into people with blue skin to make them less blue required a certain confidence in the chemistry. But Cawein had done his homework, and the chemistry was sound. Methylene blue, when introduced into the bloodstream, acts as an electron carrier effectively jump-starting the process of converting methemoglobin back into normal hemoglobin. It does the work the missing enzyme cannot. And in the Fugates, it worked with a speed that surprised even the doctor who administered it. The results were nearly instant. Family members who had lived their entire lives behind blue skin watched the color begin to fade within minutes of the injection. For the first time, they saw themselves turn pink. Kawane recalled years later that the family members were overwhelmed by what they saw. People who had never known any other appearance suddenly looked like everyone else around them, and the reaction was not quiet or composed. It was the kind of moment that does not need much description to land with full weight. The injection was not a permanent fix. The dye cleared the system over time, and the blue would gradually return. But Kawane had a follow-up answer for that as well. He supplied the affected family members with methylene blue tablets they could take daily, giving them ongoing control over their appearance for the first time in their lives. By the 1970s, the world around Troublesome Creek had changed considerably from the sealed-off hollow Martin Fugate had settled a century and a half earlier. Coal mining had brought new people into eastern Kentucky. Railroads and roads had opened routes that once did not exist. The tight circle of families who had married among themselves for generations began, slowly and then more decisively, to reach outside that circle. New bloodlines entered. The recessive gene, no longer being reinforced at the same rate, began its long retreat through the population, but it had not disappeared entirely. In 1975, a baby boy was born who would become the last known blue Fugate. His name was Benji Stacy, and he arrived in the world looking, by the accounts of those present, almost purple. The color was deep enough and unusual enough that the delivering doctor did not wait to ask questions. Benji was rushed to the University of Kentucky Medical Center, where staff prepared for a blood transfusion, assuming something had gone dangerously wrong. What stopped them was a grandmother. She had seen this before. She knew exactly what the purple skin meant and where it came from, and she told the medical staff the story of her family's long history with the condition. The team reconsidered. They examined Benji more carefully, consulted the Fugate case history, and concluded that what they were looking at was not a medical emergency, but a genetic inheritance. The boy had simply been born with the same rare condition his ancestors had carried for over 150 years. Over the following weeks, the blue faded from Benji's skin on its own. His body, unlike those of earlier Fugates, had enough enzyme function to gradually bring his methemoglobin levels down without intervention. The blue did not vanish entirely. His lips and fingernails continued to turn purple when he was cold or upset. But to the outside world, he looked like any other child. The visible legacy of Troublesome Creek had, for the first time, quietly stepped back from the surface. When Benji Stacy's blue faded and no further cases followed, it would have been easy to conclude that the story of the blue Fugates had simply ended. The inbreeding that had driven the gene to the surface had stopped. The isolated world of Troublesome Creek had opened up. The recessive gene, deprived of the conditions that had made it visible for over a century, seemed to have retreated into invisibility. But retreating is not the same as disappearing, and scientists who understood the genetics were careful not to declare the story finished. The recessive gene responsible for methemoglobinemia still exists inside the descendants of the Fugate family and the related lines that shared those same hollows for generations. It sits quietly in people who show no blue skin, no dark lips, no visible sign of anything unusual. They carry one copy of the gene without effect, just as Martin Fugate and Elizabeth Smith once did before their children revealed what both parents were hiding. As long as those carriers exist, the possibility exists with them. For the gene to surface again, two carriers would need to have children together. Given how broadly the Fugate descendants have now spread, and how thoroughly the old pattern of cousin marriage has broken down, the mathematical likelihood of that combination occurring is very small. A hematologist from the Mayo Clinic noted that cases of inherited methemoglobinemia of this type had become so rare that most practicing physicians would never encounter one in an entire career. The condition had not been eliminated. It had simply been diluted back into the vast pool of human genetic variation where it could hide indefinitely. There is also a separate path to methemoglobinemia that has nothing to do with the Fugate gene at all. Exposure to certain chemicals and drugs, including benzocaine and dapsone, can trigger the condition in anyone by disrupting the enzymes that healthy red blood cells rely on. These acquired cases appear occasionally in medical settings, entirely unconnected to Appalachian family history. They serve as a reminder that the biology behind the blue Fugates was never truly exotic. It was always a variation on mechanisms that exist in every human body. When Dr. Colwayne first went into the Kentucky hills looking for blue people, he was chasing a medical curiosity. What he found was something that reached well beyond one isolated family. The Fugate case became one of the most studied examples of autosomal recessive inheritance in American medical history, a textbook demonstration of how a rare gene, given the right conditions, can move from invisible to dominant within a surprisingly small number of generations. The science that explained the blue skin also explains something larger about how genetics works inside closed populations anywhere in the world. The confirmation of the methylene blue treatment gave researchers a clearer picture of the enzyme pathway involved. The missing enzyme, NADH, methemoglobin reductase, became better understood through the Fugate case than it had been before. Medical students learned from their story. Geneticists used their family tree as a model for teaching how recessive traits behave across generations. In a field that often works with abstract data, the Fugates provided something unusually concrete. You could see the gene's effects with your own eyes, trace it through documented family lines, and watch it respond to targeted treatment in real time. But what the DNA also revealed was something about the conditions that allow hidden genetic material to surface. Isolation was the key ingredient. Without the geographical barriers of eastern Kentucky, without the limited gene pool that those barriers created, the Fugate gene would almost certainly have remained invisible. One or two carriers marrying into a wider population would have passed the gene along without consequence, generation after generation, undetected and harmless. It was the closing of the circle, the repeated return to the same small group of families, that gave the recessive gene the opening it needed. That lesson extends far beyond the Fugates. It applies to any population that remains genetically isolated over long periods. Whether by geography, culture, or circumstance, the blue skin was the visible result. The real revelation was what the DNA showed about the hidden architecture of human inheritance, patient, silent, and waiting for exactly the right conditions to finally make itself known. The blue Fugates of Appalachia left behind something that no amount of isolation could contain forever. Their story traveled out of the Kentucky hills and into medical textbooks, genetics classrooms, and the broader conversation about what DNA can reveal when science finally arrives with the right questions. They were not a cautionary tale, though their circumstances were hard. They were something rarer than that. They were a family who endured generations of difference with quiet stubbornness, raised children, grew old, and kept living while the world around them slowly caught up to what they already knew about themselves. What the DNA revealed was not a curse or a defect in any meaningful human sense. It was a recessive gene, amplified by geography, reinforced by necessity, and ultimately understood by a doctor curious enough to go looking. The blue skin that made strangers stare and neighbors whisper turned out to be one of the most teachable examples of inherited genetics in American medical history. Luna lived blue and died at 77. Benji was born blue and grew up pink. Between those two lives, a century and a half of science finally caught up to one family's blood. Their story is a reminder that the most extraordinary chapters of human history are sometimes written not in capitals or courtrooms, but in the quiet hollows of mountains where people simply tried to live. The Fugates did that, and in doing so, they gave the world something it did not expect, a mystery hidden in plain sight, solved at last by the very science their ancestors never lived to see.
Thanks for watching this video. Before you go, your raw DNA data has hidden stories waiting to be unlocked. Tap the link in the description to download your ebook copy and find out what they are.